say thank you for joining us on another episode of 5 and 6. That is a understanding of space-time medicine, which represents medical mathematics, innovation, uh, East Asian medicine, and various lineages of holistic practice. In general, the multidimensionality of space-time medicine goes back to Imhotep, ancient Egypt, and many more. And so, in this particular episode and series, we'd like to discuss these ancient practices that could possibly be future technologies. Um, and so, how they benefit humanity and so on. I'm your host, Dr. Bay, a medical mathematician, author, father, innovator, and practitioner of East Asian medicine, and a little bit more, of course. My role here is to bring the most fascinating and remarkable human beings in their field to share content that will help you navigate the changing world. So wonderful. Today I have the emeritus, the esteemed um, Dr. William Morris. He is an accomplished human being and professor of what we call Chinese medicine, of course, also known as East Asian medicine, referencing the East Asian to East Asia there, and has 30 plus years in the field from the center of, I think the work is Pulse Diagnostics, classical Chinese medicine, and really bringing awareness to the higher pedagogy of East Asian medicine, Chinese medicine in North America. It's really unparalleled. So we'd like to open up our discussion here with Dr. Morris and discuss his background, how he came to the medicine, route to the profession, and of course, revelations and innovations going forward. With that being said, I'd like to welcome Dr. Morris.
Thank you, Dr. B. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah. Yeah. Very, very
well,
good.
You know, we've known each other for a little while. I first met you, I remember, really fascinating actually. I first met you, my wife was dancing for a West African dance company here in Austin, Texas. And of course, AAOM, the school that brought you to Austin, there was a after party at one of the Southwest symposiums. I forget which one it was. And at this kind of after party, there were, of course, the dancers. My wife was one of them, and so on. And then they finished, and I then saw you get on stage and begin to play flute. I think it was the flute. That's how I first met you. And I said, oh, wow, this is the new president. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I believe that was 2006, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
Wow.
And my first experiences in life as a professional were as a musician.
Wow. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how the upbringing that you received, where you were born, and so on, how that influenced these skill sets that you share with the world now.
Okay, well, I think I'll start a little bit forward and say that where I'm focused, if you will, is transdisciplinary, which is not really a focus. It's a very, very widespread palette. So now I was born in Germany and lived in France, the son of an Air Force intelligence officer. Mm-hmm. And my father swore that that's not an oxymoron. But but in any regard, we lived in many places, of course. And that affected my ability to see lots and lots of different perspectives, which went, of course, into my role as a leader in some of these institutions and organizations and so forth. And his leadership skills as a military officer also influenced me in that regard. And then my mother was an artist. She had a master's degree in interior design, and ultimately practiced feng shui and Reiki and such. And so both of them had a very strong influence on me my father in terms of structure and discipline, and my mother in terms of creativity. And so my first forays into the world were through music. I was on the road playing music, and that's when I got exposed to Chinese medicine. I also got exposed to deep astrological concepts relative to cycles, and that work remains with me today. But the exposure to Chinese medicine on the road, eventually in 1977, I came to an epiphany that was not going to be the path for me. And I was exposed to many healing techniques in that year. So I left the road that fall and began to study healing methods. I encountered a man named Ron Teagard, and he taught essentially Taoist herbal medicine. And I took that up and began to practice it. And I ended up, through working his front office in exchange for classes, I was offered a job at Cedars-Sinai office towers, managing an herb dispensary for a large clinic on the 11th floor. They took a large piece of the 11th floor there. Anyway, so it was there that I came to the conclusion that acupuncture and what we call Chinese medicine, acupuncture and herbal medicine and homeopathy, all those three features became part of my approach to assisting others, which was what I was devoted to. Healing, this fundamental healing in terms of our human nature. And so that set forth the stage. And so I didn't look back. So it's now been since 1980. So, and actually 42 years now into the conversation with, well, certainly more than 40,000 patient visits, synthesizing all these methods of thought. And so I've been so blessed and so privileged in this life to be able to help this many people. And so as I went along, I was also teaching during the entirety of my coming of age. At the age of 19, I taught music, but by the time I was into acupuncture school, by my late 20s, I was also teaching biosciences review courses for students. I was teaching various healing techniques and put myself through acupuncture school teaching these healing techniques. Yeah, and so this conversation kept unfolding, and I really felt rather compelled in the deepest level of my heart to this practice, and so continued. And upon practicing for a while in Los Angeles, I made the decision to move to Massachusetts to be closer to some parts of my family, and also to a spiritual teacher, and then also to a man named Leon Hammer, who was very influential. And I ended up co-teaching with Dr. Hammer for 7 yethis. And I studied also with his teacher. I would go down to New York City or down to Connecticut, study with his teacher, Johnny Chef Shen. So that was a family lineage, right? It was derived from what's called the Ding family. It goes back to about the 16 or 1700s, somewhere between Shanghai and Beijing. And so Leon would come stay at my house. We'd see patients together. I'd put together classes for him. And then I would teach learners and prepare them to study with a more lengthy course of work with Dr. Hammer. And that went on. I eventually outgrew the community that I was living in at the time in Western Massachusetts, needing more stimulation and feeling compelled as a mission to bring this body of work into the formal education, because I felt that the way that the education was going was not consistent with what I knew could be produced as outcomes. As educational outcomes. So I moved back to Los Angeles and took on an academic role at Emperor's College as dean, and served as dean there for 7 years. During that period of time, I earned a master's degree in medical education, and assisted in the development of standards for doctoral level education for Chinese medicine through the Accreditation Commission. I served on task force, and I was at that time also serving on the leadership of the American Association of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, where eventually I became president thereof. But in this process at Emperor's College and in the leadership of organizational development for the field and the development of these doctoral standards, we created a doctoral program there at Emperor's College, and as a result of that experience, I then, upon departing Emperor's, there was a change in presidential seat and leadership, and I was asked to step aside while the organization reformulated itself. And feeling obligation to sustenance of my family, I took a role at Samra University and developed their doctoral program. Now, of course, since then, that school dissolved and is now, their documents are in possession of one of the schools down in Orange County. But upon completing the development of their doctoral program as a consultant, I was offered the job as president at AAOM. So I arrived in AAOM in the fall of '05. That's why I can remember that we met in '06, because that was the next symposium. The school ran a symposium every year, and I participated in that symposium on other occasions as faculty. And so I had a long-standing relationship with the school before getting there.
I see.
And one of my tasks, I had two tasks as president of AAOM. One was to develop doctoral program. The other one was to take the school from programmatic accreditation, which is technicalities of accreditation, where to regional accreditation, which is like your normal university accreditation. So the programmatic is in discipline, nursing, law, all the professions have accrediting bodies for the particular content relative to the profession, whereas the university setting credits the school at large and its ability to participate at the level of educational standards for universities. So we took AAOM to that level, and they're still recognized through the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools as a postgraduate degree granting institution for both master's and doctoral degrees.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's how we met. Actually, yeah. Was this process that stage was how we met. Yeah.
Wow, multidisciplinarian. Is that what I heard?
Actually, it was just transdisciplinary.
Transdisciplinary. Okay.
Transdisciplinary. I went while I was there I arrived in Texas, and the state goes, we don't accept your 2 doctorates in Chinese medicine. I had an OMD from Samra University, and I had a DAOM from Emperor's College. And they said, we don't accept that because it was only programmatically accredited. And I said, and they said, you have to have a PhD. No. Now, never mind the fact that there are no PhDs required in rules and regulations for any university president. Mm. But the team or the staffers determined that this was actually going to be a requirement for me, and they could do that. It was within their purview, so they did. And I went and got a degree at California Institute of Integral Studies, and that degree was in transdisciplinary studies. So what it does is it takes the intersection between different disciplines. It's not interdisciplinary. It's not just put a bunch of disciplines together and have them work, but the transdisciplinary looks for those features in common between a set of disciplines and then takes that essence distilled and creates body of knowledge. So it is what is considered to be creative knowledge building as opposed to reconstructive let's say reconstructive knowledge building, or like using a historical basis, or what's called reproductive knowledge building, where you take the previously existing knowledge body and essentially keep it together. Here, we're looking at the interface between several disciplines. And for me, those several disciplines were one, historical, pre-modern practices with modern practices, practices in the West relative to practices in the East, right? Practices of epistemology, how one knows, which became my dissertation, was how does one know what one knows in the clinic? Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially there, and there is a transdisciplinary movement, and this might, let's say, in a research model, one might combine, say, qualitative research, record of the people's individual experiences, local experience, and so forth, combined with large population numbers would be an integral or transdisciplinary approach to research methods. And the NIH has funded some transdisciplinary research projects in medicine.
And some of these might include some of the psilocybin, more recent multidisciplinary kind of funding that I'm thinking of, where they combine this human experience, right, with numbers of maps and that they collect, and so on and so forth.
That's correct. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's a kind of like it's a synthesis between local knowledge and general knowledge. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the fascinating elements of the medicine that we've grown to love, as you say, with all of our heart, or at least I'm included in that, I think, too.
You are. I'm sure.
is this transdisciplinary understanding, if you would, of how music, weather, all things external affected things internal, and how we can learn, and that is different for each and every individual human experience. If you could talk about how there are methods, observations built into the medicine, depending on where you are, you can take it as far as you wish to go.
That's funny. I coined the term in my doctoral dissertation, and there are some psychiatric movements now that are beginning to use this term. And I coined the term eco-psychosocial. And that's a reference to ecosystems, both internal and external, and the psyche, or the spirit level, right? And the social, which is our shared human experience. And that this, in fact, described more accurately the totality of wellness that a person experiences than what conventional medicine had been using in its attempt to become more inclusive. And that was the term psychosocial. They used the word, and so by adding the term eco to psychosocial, that became then, for me, a more comprehensive way of describing what has been at the core of Chinese medicine from the original corpus of texts. In particular, the Yellow Emperor's Classic is derived essentially of a philosophical worldview that is composed of behavioral, right? If I behave in accordance with the seasons, my health will be good. If this is a Confucian moral order of centrism, whereby if I also care for my family, my community, my nation, that order can be sustained. And so that's the essential feature of the Yellow Emperor's Classic opening, and in relationship of the human being to the seasons. So the seasons that's describing meteorological phenomenon, right? So that we are treating in context of the year, that the seasonal components of the year, but it's not limited to that. It also looks at biorhythms of the day, right? Which is, at the heart of the work that you're doing, much of it. there's the biorhythms of the lunar month. And there happens to be biomedical research that explores each of these, what I call nested time frames, a day, month, year, right? And so, of course, the diurnal rhythms are oftentimes studied on the basis of, say, sleep patterns or any kind of a pattern of psychiatric instability that may come at sunset in people with cognitive disorders, these kinds of things. And then we look at the lunar cycle, and there's a few factors tied in with the lunar cycle, such as improved cardiovascular surgeries performed on a full moon, or alterations in psychiatric medication needs throughout the course of the lunar cycle, or performance of kids in school settings based on lunar cycles, and that goes on and on. So one of the things fascinating about the lunar cycle is improved athletic performance on a full moon. And so I have all these citations, but in any regard, the annual cycle, there's the Taganetti lab out of a university in New York City did 1.6 million participant analysis of diseases by month and showed a clear demarcation of this 12-fold division of the year. Well, that's the same as the signs. So the annual rhythms are also a factor, and we can look at seasonal affective disorder as a feature of annual, or recurrent allergies during particular seasons. These are all taking place within the rhythmicity, if you will, of the annual movement. And then there are other cycles. This is a fascinating one, the 18.6 year cycle of the lunar nodes, which create eclipses, right? And we can see studies that show heavy bloom of marsh mosquitoes along this 18.6 year cycle. So if we look at that, traditionally in India and many pre-modern cultures, the nodal axis has been correlated with epidemic disease processes. And okay, so there's these types of cyclical phenomena for which there's plenty of evidence in medical literature, not coming out of any other place but hospitalist observations. Yeah. So maybe you can help redirect me here at this point.
Sure. Well, I was just talking about this to another practitioner, how I think really, as far as some revelations that do exist from just practice and, of course, research, seemingly some of the research of now and the future revolves around two main systems in the body, and that's neurological, digestive, in concert with studying, say, lunar cycles, more celestial cycles, to bring forth some evidentiary, innovation in medicine. Where do you think we are with those at this stage? Are we really expanding towards that just as a species, or do we not care?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for the species, but I know that I can. And I think this is going to grow. I really do. We had it. Ideas fall in and out of favor, and so the notion that this greater cosmology in which we live, this larger soup of reality in which we live, has absolutely no correlation to us, is a direct result of post-Enlightenment philosophical and scientific thought. And as such, it has led to a disconnected state of affairs between the human and their environment. And the key to health in these pre-modern cultures was the connection between these. And so I believe that's coming back. And so no matter how we parse it, if we're looking at one cycle or another, almost doesn't make any difference. But one thing we do know is that there's a shift in genomic expression during the course of a day, during the course of a month, during the course of a year. And Chengdu TCM University faculty were being heavily funded for their research on the use of acupuncture and shifting genomic expressions. And so the genome is a kind of like in a sense, its own living, breathing thing, just as the virome or our microbiome, or all of these systems, biological systems, all have fluxes that are in tune with the movement of these daily, monthly, annual, and beyond cycles.
Yes, and do you see this? This nexus of the ohms, more so now than ever before. Well, I guess we could say in our lifetime. You and I haven't been dead before that we remember, I guess. But it's just where, wow, that genome, so to speak, a lot of fervent, sometimes I think fanatical possibilities going on as we speak, that I'm seeing in the news and in different places, and a lot of it hastened because of where we are in this COVID world.
Yeah, you just spoke to remembering where we are and so forth, and it just reminded me of research that has been done out of Tibet, where young children have to identify their possessions from a previous lifetime, and there's many experiments along those lines. And the question is, well, how many times does that experiment have to be conducted in order for it to suggest that there might be some truth here? But and that goes on to the ohms, because part of the genome or the microbiome is that which is transferred from generation to generation. And historically, which is, you well know, the ancestral influences and what has now become a concept of epigenetic or epigenetic trauma or realization that the awakened ancestors somehow may be influencing our own state of awakeness as fundamentally aware, enlightened human beings.
So for everyone who's listening, hopefully, of course, if you have any questions, feel free to send those in. This is a recording, but of course, we will make ourselves available to answer in some medium going forward. I'd like to pivot just a little here, and looking at the revelation of, the revelatory aspect of what we do, and how, as current practitioners of the medicine can also grasp, even if it's just a small piece. In regards to, say, pulse and pulse diagnostics, when was that for you?
When did that? It took place for me from the very beginning.
Okay.
1980. I was studying with Ron Teagarden, and he taught me pulse diagnostic techniques that I used immediately. And I would do acupressure and feel immediately the change in the pulse. So that altered my perspective, because how pulse is often taught in a conventional TCM school is a lot of discussion and memorization and a small amount of practice. But essentially, there's this process of collecting the history and doing the history and physical. And it's part of take the history and do the conversation and so forth, and then do the physics, then do the pulse assessment, and then do the treatment. And then that's how the flow goes. And of course, as you know, my whole approach to that conversation is I want the pulse as an immediate representation of the deeper states of the individual as they're unfolding within the clinical setting. Yes. And that allows me to have a depth of perception, because it's the bloodstream, and that comes from the heart. And that stream of blood also happens to be continuous with the stream of water on the planet, but also the stream of blood from our ancestors. And so, I mean, and I know that's a little far reaching, but the thing is that does happen to be the backdrop of what's taking place. Now, our ability to perceive it may or may not be present in any one moment at all, but still, it remains. And so, but as an individual is becoming, their armoring starts to unpack as trust unfolds in the relationship, and they're able to become genuine with the experience they're having as a human being, that pulse at that moment becomes revelatory for the practitioner.
Mm-hmm. I love it.
Yeah, man.
It's amazing. Wow. You know, when we think of pulse, we go back to Li Shichen, at least in teaching and schooling and so on.
Yeah.
What you learn in the lineage, of course, the Ding family, and of course, Dr. Shen and Dr. Hammer. How does that begin to play out and unfolding as well in the clinic for you at that particular time?
Oh, okay. So what I just shared with you about my experience with the pulse is my own work.
Yes.
And I have to say this, that my studies with Dr. Shen and Hammer made it possible to come to that point. But when I did the work with them, it was typically done in the way that I described, where you do the history and physical, and the pulse is part of the physical, and you do the treatment, right? So this idea of a constant biofeedback system really comes from Japanese schools, mm-hmm. I'd say, mm-hmm. Really. And I think that's fair to say that my studies with Dr. Kobayashi Sensei really had a large impact in that regard. But let's look at so Li Shichen. You mentioned Li Shichen, which I wrote the book Li Shichen Pulse Studies, an illustrated guide for People's Medical Publishing House. Now, this came well after my years of study with Shen and Hammer, okay. And my PhD focused on a transdisciplinary approach to pulse diagnosis, where I took lots of different perspectives. And it was when that was complete that people approached me about that book. So that book was a snapshot of the practices of the man Li Shichen, who was also developed one of the largest herbal materia medica in the history of Chinese medicine. And so that's a snapshot in 1700s. But the record of pulse diagnosis precedes the Han Dynasty in texts that were found along the Silk Road. There's a little bit of content on it in the Dunhuang manuscripts and other manuscripts. But it gets articulated better in the late Han, around 200 AD, in the Yellow Emperor's Classic, in what was also called the Difficult Classic, which had the first 22 chapters, Nanjing, all pulse diagnosis. And then, but also the infectious disease model from that period, called the Shanghanlan, damage by cold, very excellent essays on pulse diagnosis. So I used those, became the basis of my text. And what happens is those, you can say that those are canonical. They're coming from canon. They're these sacrosanct texts, if you will. And whereas Shen and Hammer are coming from family lineage. Right. So the canonical texts are arising in the presence of the emperor and receive support from the state in their development. Whereas the family lineage is often done, held private to the family, because it's the means of sustenance in the world for that family. And so they're cultivated in a different way, and it's handed down from generation to generation, and it's very practical because these people have to support their families on it. Whereas the texts within the realm of the empire become a little bit different value system in their construction. Both are important vessels for transmission of knowledge. And then we come forward into the early 1900s, or the let's say 19th century forward. Educational systems get formalized.
Yes.
And the knowledge product is controlled by the state for different purposes.
For different purposes, yeah.
And so those are the three primary threads. So my transdisciplinary work was involving all of those three threads.
Okay.
And so that became what was then I call Neoclassical Pulse Diagnosis, my book that I published through my own publishing house.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Congratulations on that. Yeah. It's and when you say threads, help me understand that though a little bit further in that development of the pulse for those times.
Right. So so in the creation of a standardized educational system authorized by the state, committees come together and they come to an agreement about, well, what are these diagnostics, what compose them, and that then becomes standardized into the texts. Whereas the family lineage is going off on the side and may be unfettered of the policies and procedures of the state. So you get different nuances of information, and so when you combine the two, you get a more full representation of the potential of this really infinite knowledge base that is the history of Chinese medicine. It's like huge. And I remember Paul Unschuld, historian and translator, saying once that, like the TCM, the conventional medicine that's taught in schools, is like, it's a little pejorative, but still, it's like a little crib within a mansion of what is the entirety of the disciplines of Chinese medicine. Now, but however, what is the advantage of a crib? Focus, right? Structure, focus. There's advantages to the system and way it's taught, and so, but then there's depth to be reached by going outside that crib, and it's wise for any practitioner to entertain both fields and perspectives. And so then also, so you have the schools, and then also we have an explosion of classically based or canonically based, if you will, practices centered upon the early imperial documents. And so they also have their values. Although I remember days, Dr. Shen and Dr. Hammer, I always repeat Dr. Shen, book, trash, because Dr. Shen was only interested in what worked. And so sometimes the books are involved in some speculative theory, which doesn't hold up in practice as much. So when there's a constant distillation of in the moment, in the practice, by the practitioner, in what I call a contemplative hermeneutic, whereby the lore of the tradition is taken into deep contemplation by the practitioner, and then from there taken into practice, and from there the results are seen, and then that gets shared with learners. This is what I call a participatory worldview. It gets shared with learners, gets shared with colleagues, and so forth. And this becomes a well-rounded way of generating a body of knowledge and transmitting it.
And in that essence, that freedom, really, that seed that one connects with, it's so it's really like a type of grace.
Yes.
That's embedded into that seed. I mean, I've experienced it, of course, and I think it's part of the transmission that you share with us, knowingly or unknowingly, for the students who work with you, in that being able to assess with the freedom or lack of restriction, if you would, into that contemplative hermetic. That's been my experience. It just opens up a whole world.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I see the classics. It's not as a perennial truth unto themselves, but rather a conceptual frame which the practitioner takes in and operates as a seed for bearing fruit of that wisdom and that grace. Yeah.
Yeah, because teachings can change, and they generally do, and so they should be updated and so on. To pivot again here a little bit in regards to cycles and patterns and how they affect health and disease. Could you elaborate a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, like, for instance, a young woman is having problems with fertility. One of the very first things that a Chinese medicine practitioner is going to do is to ensure that the period comes at a regular time and that that it's timely, that it's not coming early, sometimes late, other times, or coming always early or coming always late. And that's one level of harmonization with time. Harmonization with the moon, actually, is what they call it in the early cultures, right? Pre-modern cultures, non-scientized cultures, have a very direct relationship with the moon and its light and its experience relative to plant life, farming. The agrarian cultures have a much deeper sense of the rhythmicity of monthly and yearly phenomenon. But that's but that's one place where we see it the most. And in early Mesopotamia, you can see 13 slices carved in the stone carvings on a horn held by a woman. Well, these are the 13 periods that take place in a year when it's happening in a healthy way. So that's one way. Another, of course, sleep. One of the fastest ways to treat, of course, something like chronic fatigue or fibromyalgia, which both have sleep disorders at the core of the process, is adjusting the sleep rhythms through the acupuncture process. And when that takes place, and there are many techniques that can be used, but when that happens, the possibility of wellness for that individual is exponentially increased. Yeah.
And for those joining us or listening, again, feel free to bring forth your questions, and we will answer them in an orderly fashion here. Do you see any hope that this framework is being integrated into the future of medicine? Some of the things that we're discussing in the broad stream of medicine.
I do. I mean, I actually have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah.
This is a wellness model, and so part of what drives medicine, of course, is industrialization. And so when that's going on, it's not in the interest of the investors for this prospect necessarily to be effective, but it will be, because our humanity comes forward, our humanity prevails, and that which is good and right and healthy will prevail.
Mm-hmm. The kind of reductionist theory that we touched on earlier, suppression and so on, that happens essentially is, as you just mentioned, for humanity to prevail, there must be some of that which lessens or is obliterated. How about that? I don't know. But so that hope that we're discussing is present. But again, we were talking about genomics and things that are happening with COVID. COVID is seen for some as a type of catalyst towards us getting there. Would you agree with that? And if not, why so?
Well, okay, so I teach infectious disease models at the doctoral level. Okay. And so that's, of course, in Chinese medicine, it's called the Shanghanlun, which is the cold damages, and then the Wenbing, which is the heat damages, right? And so the Wenbing, the heat damage one, has seasonal distinctions for each of the diagnostic criteria, whereas the Shanghanlun has daily distinctions, the rhythms of the day for the symptoms. It's part of how the diagnoses are made. But more importantly, every significant civilizational shift has been preceded by an epidemic. And so we can go back to the plague of Athens and the movement from antiquity into the classical period. And then we can go from there to the Justinian plague, where we see the movement from the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages. And then we see the Black Plague, where we see the movement from the Middle Ages into the Renaissance period, right? So this is going on. Well, we are now in what's called a fourth industrial revolution, right? And so this particular plague, if you will, is part of that. Now, the only difference between this plague and let's say the plague of Athens was that half the people you knew at that time would be dead if you were still alive. Whereas now, those numbers are nowhere near the same. But the fact that it's tied in with a trigger point in the evolution of humanity and civilization is pretty obvious, and it will become more so as time goes forward.
I'm so glad you're teaching that at the school. That's amazing. Wow. I hope everyone is enjoying this as much as I am. So to just review here, we know that there are systems embedded in the medicine we practice that can portend, describe, also show the nature, provide prescription, and so on as to epidemics and to great shifts. Do you wonder sometimes, say a Zhang Zhongjing or Li Shichen, or where they must have been to bring this forth and describe it on paper, and it still has relevance 2,000-3,000 years, 4,000 years later?
That's why Zhang Zhongjing is called the saint of medicine in many circles, right?
Yeah.
You know, I have wondered that, and I have no clue, because it's just profound. It's so deep and profound that it's the best I can do to pay homage and do what I can to carry that forward.
Yes. Yes, I have this. Someone just out of the blue sent this to me.
Oh,
and he's got cool fingernails too, I think there. So
is that right? Look at that. That's a nice one. Yeah.
Yeah. So they wrote a little nice something on the back there.
Yeah.
I don't even know who it is, but I agree. And wow. Well, you know, this is the level that we all, you know, hope to attend one day, and we're super grateful for your efforts, your work in this world, and what you're doing to transmit this deeper dimension, these seeds that will ultimately bear fruit. I'm a witness to it. Just wanted to tell you that, as they say, giving you your flowers. Yes, because you've affected so many of us in a very positive and meaningful way. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. That's really appreciate that.
Well, this is the segment where, or the point of the interview, where we say, for those of you who are familiar with your works, I like for you to just share a few of the books that you have. We'll be sharing those pictures, segments as well throughout this interview, but also your website, your social media handles, and where they can find some of these products.
Okay, so I'm my email address is a Gmail address.
Okay,
and it's my first initial and last name, W. Morris 33. So that's a great way to go. I'm also have an author page on Amazon, and my books can be found there on Amazon. And And I'm here living in British Columbia now, and I live and work here with my wife Teresa, and we run what's called the Kootenai Sound Healing Center. So my latest project has been involved with developing sound healing techniques, and we have essentially a gong temple with some 20 gongs in it, and space for people to lie out, and we put together from an eco-psychosocial view. We take the position of the planets, and these gongs are tuned to the planets, and we do maps that show the construction of the sky at the moment of this gong journey. So we're doing the frequencies that are tuned to the orbital speed of these planets, and then she plays the gongs and I play the music, and it's really an unbelievable experience. And but it's, for a privileged few that managed to make it here, and but we're pretty grateful. Now we have a website for that. It's called the Kootenai Sound Healing Center, but one can also just use the initials kshc.ca and get there. And then of course I still have affiliations with AOMA, Graduate School of Integrative Medicine, and so that's aoma.edu, and I can be reached through any of these venues. My personal email address, of course, wmorris33@gmail is the best. So I think that's pretty good. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, just like to say, Dr. Morris, as you know, very dear to us here, and please support him. Please support this work. And just like to say on our outro here, it's been a joy interviewing you today and speaking with you. Thank you for being a guest on 5 and 6.
Thank you, sir. I
really appreciate forward to having you back. Again, to everyone who's been listening, we really appreciate the support, and we thank you for being a part of this experience. If you'd like to learn more, participate in any of our courses or webinars, please go to bayacupuncture.com, where you can find all things about me there. Again, thank you, and we will talk soon.